The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. I think maybe to remind people who Yousef Palani is, first of all, before we go into the story, the latest story about him. But yeah, he was a very dark character. And what happened in Sligo in 2022 is like something of a crime drama.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually unprecedented. And you do wonder if it really seeped into the public consciousness as much as some of these, because it's effectively a serial killing. Mm-hmm. Now, Yousef Palani was convicted of murdering two gay men in Sligo, and a very, very violent assault where a third man feared for his life, all within the space of a few days. After contacting these men on dating apps, effectively, he
sought them out. He went on. He had a profile himself on a dating app, and he arranged to meet them. I mean, they all, presumably the men who died tragically aren't here to describe what they thought, but the victim who did live said that he thought he was just going to meet a guy, and I mean, you have to remember the level of violence showed is effectively unprecedented. One of the victims was decapitated, literally, by Palani. So you do wonder, like, has it, if that had been a couple of young women killed and a third one very lucky to escape with their life, would it be in the public consciousness a lot? Not that makes any difference to those victims, whether it's in the public consciousness or not. But Yousef Palani was convicted, given an automatic 2 life sentences for the 2 murders and a further 20 years for the assault of the third man, and is currently in prison. A really, really shocking case. And there is an element of, because he pled guilty, you don't hear this extensive evidence that you do in many murder trials, where you hear a few weeks of, the state of mind of the accused and maybe some of the background. What Yousef Palani's motives are, we don't really hear from his own voice, but it's very clear from what the guard said in court. He was motivated by a hatred of gay men, a prejudice, and that is the motivation. The fact that they were gay men, and he killed them for that reason. And you also heard during that trial, or during the sentencing hearing, effectively, that Yousef Palani, at least there is a belief that he had some sexual contact with one of his victims. He had denied he was gay himself, saying stuff like, you can't be Muslim and be gay. But clearly there is a belief that he was motivated by his own, or may have been motivated by his own attitude to his own sexuality, effectively. So he was originally from Iraq, and he came to Ireland with his family when he was 6 years of age.
Yeah.
Now, the family, as far as we know, have totally disowned him, horrified by what he did.
Yeah, I mean, they've actually spoken to the Sunday World back last year and said that directly. They didn't appear in court and support him throughout it. They had no truck with what went on, as there was no excuses given or anything of that sort. He'd been in Ireland, like he was a Kurd, I believe, which would be, a people from the northern part of Iraq. And he had travelled to Ireland. The Kurds obviously came under, particularly under Saddam Hussein, they suffered the genocide, really. And so a lot of Kurds moved to Europe during those years, and he landed in Ireland and was raised here.
So it was in April of 2022, and on the 9th of April that he met first with Anthony Burke at Cleaver Road in Sligo. Now, Palani was living in a place called Markievicz Heights in Sligo at the time. And Mr. Burke, in his victim impact statement, said on that night of the incident, he thought he was meeting somebody to have an intimate moment with. He said, "I didn't realise I was going to meet a coward and a monster that would destroy my life." And his heart went out to the other families of the actual victims who didn't survive it. He said he was very distressed. He basically met him and was ferociously attacked by him. He's still in a lot of pain and has suffered insomnia ever since. And clearly what happened over the next few days must leave him with nightmares beyond belief, because on the 10th of April, a day later, Palani met with Aidan Moffat at Catron Heights in Sligo, and 2 days later with Michael Snee at City View in Sligo, and that was April the 12th. So he pleaded guilty to the murder of both of those, and it was in the case of Mr. Moffat that he cut off his victim's head and placed it on the bed facing the door. I mean, just horrific.
Yeah, I mean, totally horrific. And of course, like both of those victims who'd lived in Sligo all their lives, like you know, you really got a sense from the people who knew them and from, you know, who spoke out in the aftermath of the death, that they both seemed kind of real gentle, nice, good people who obviously nobody deserves it, but you know, really horrific what had gone on.
It's
and
like everybody's ultimate nightmare about those bloody dating apps,
yeah,
isn't it? Like, I mean, you know what I mean? You don't know who they're almost feel like when you see something like this, it feels like they can be hunting ground for somebody as dark an individual as that. Easy hunting ground. Now, look, in the past, before they existed, people like him would have gone to certain pubs or whatever and found other ways of carrying out murders. But yeah, it's just, you know, when you see those sort of people,
yeah, I mean, they thrive. Yeah,
people so easily, you know. During the case, Detective Garda Conor Jordan said that the Gardaí believed that Palani carried out the attacks due to hostility and prejudice against gay men, and said there was no evidence, because Palani said he heard these voices in his head, there was no evidence to support that, and that he may have exaggerated or fabricated them entirely, which makes him an even kind of more sinister character, that he was, if that was the case, that he was able to come up with it as an excuse.
Yeah, I mean, like, we've had many cases and people will think of them off the tops of their heads, not to compare these things directly, but where people have committed horrendous acts of violence. There's obviously an opening there, and the law very clearly recognises insanity would be a defence, that if you didn't know what you were doing, if you were hearing voices, if that could be proven and shown, that you could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, that was not put forward by Palani, you know, so it just simply wasn't, the proof wasn't there. And I mean, if it was there, it would have been put forward.
So Palani was taken to Portlaoise prison, where he has...
Yeah, I think he was actually first.
Mountjoy, was he?
He was in first in Mountjoy, yeah.
And he has proven to be a difficult prisoner. He, of course, last March was attacked himself by another difficult prisoner by the name of Stephen Penrose, who I think we have a podcast relating to him if you go back over the episodes, because he himself is in jail after being convicted of
He's convicted of murder, yeah.
Murder.
It's connected. I mean, Stephen Penrose would have been very much an associate of the Brian Rattigan drugs gang. He's convicted of a very, very violent murder of a guy called Philip Finnegan, believed to be on behalf of the Brian Rattigan gang. Stephen Penrose would again be one of the most feared prisoners in the prison system. He would be kept in large part away from the general community of prisoners because he is a dangerous guy. I think he has, which you hear in relation to Palani as well, this thing called the P19, which is basically a disciplinary sanction placed on prisoners by the prison service. Penrose would have clocked up a huge amount of them. Last March, he would have attacked Palani, and Palani was then moved for his own protection to Portlaoise, where he'd be on very restricted, kept away from the other prisoners, basically.
Yeah, for his own safety. But anyway, he himself now has been put under this, what we call barrier handling in the jail, because he attacked an officer.
Yeah. I mean, so what happened was last week was that he was out in the exercise yard. He'd have limited time. They all have limited time, but because if prisoners are on these restricted regimes, they effectively have to be kept away from the general population and exercised on their own. He was out in the yard in Portlaoise. He was told it's time to go back into your cell. He seems to have kicked up a fuss. The prison guard went out to try and convince him that he had to go back in, and he went what was described as went berserk. Now, look, prison guards are highly trained to diffuse these situations, and also, obviously violence is a risk of it. But the attack, so they know how to handle themselves. But so for him, Palani actually hospitalised this prison guard. So that shows you the level of violence that's needed, because these guys do tend to know how to.
And it seemed to be just a case of there was no set to or anything. It was just your time is up.
Your time is up.
The exercise didn't you come, and he just
went.
it.
Yeah. So like, I mean, and it's obviously a risk for prison staff that they face every day, but there's some prisoners in the prison system. I think Eamon Dillon has spoken about it before. Yeah. So there's this that have to be handled as if they are a risk at all moments. Every interaction with them has to be handled as a potential risk for violence, and they get put on this system called barrier handling. And you probably have seen, everybody will have seen it maybe in American TV programs as people are being brought to court or whatever. But they're basically surrounded, if they have to be moved, at any point during their incarceration, they're surrounded by prison officers with riot shields. So they are in the centre of a circle of riot shields, effectively, and that's the only way they can be moved. It's called barrier handling. It's an old system, actually.
Yeah, and there's a special way that the doors at the prison have to be opened and closed so as to keep them confined into one area at all times.
Now, it's been very controversial over the years because civil liberties groups have described it as being inhumane. It's been a feature in Dáil debates, people calling for it to be eliminated totally. However, it still remains. Now, I think it's used to a far lesser extent, but it is going to be used with Palani for the obvious reason that you can't, if you can't sort of say to a prisoner, time to come in, and that sparks that level of violence and that level of reaction, there doesn't seem to be any other way to deal with it. Like, there's a very small number of prisoners actually on that barrier handling system. Even some of the most extremely violent prisoners like Warren Dumbrell and these, they probably aren't on that system at all anymore. The prison service
certainly not all the time. I think they're only on it, and I suppose if you prove yourself then to be trusting again that you're not going to lash out.
No, I mean, there are some people that have been on it in recent times, like a guy called Stephen Egan. He, a very harrowing case where he beat another prisoner to death, a guy called Gary Douche, in a cell in 2007. Stephen Egan would be somebody.
I remembered that case so much because it's just the whole claustrophobia of that. Imagine being stuck in a cell with a guy like that, and I think he just basically suffocated him to death. Lay on him.
Yeah, I mean, really a huge man, Stephen Egan. Now genuinely, I think suffering from psychiatric conditions. I think that's been part of his case, but an horrific death that poor man suffered at his hands. Yeah. So he would have at times be on a barrier handling situation. There's another guy called Brendan Cummins, regarded as being one of the most volatile prisoners in the system. And he has actually taken a case about, being kept. I think the case is still going through the courts about the fact he is being kept in solitary confinement for so much of his incarceration. But, he's been on that barrier handling system, and that featured as part of his case. He's a young guy who's serving, he's a sentence for attacking a Garda with a samurai sword. But so there are an extreme number of these guys that have that, that the prison service believe there's a huge risk to their members, and Palani is now joining that.
Yeah. What's his purpose? Do we know anything about him really before these attacks occurred out of the blue? Did he have previous convictions? And
He didn't have a lot. I mean, I don't know if he had very
He's a
minor.
man, what, in his 30s?
No, he's a young man.
He looks in his 30s, but he's clearly younger than that.
He's only in his early to mid 20s. Obviously, didn't have any history from a teenager of any sort of extreme violence.
Sentenced at 23 years of age.
Yeah.
There was a profile done of him by a journalist, Orca Crowley, in the Examiner at the time, and people had described him to her as sort of giddy and daft, that nobody thought that he would have been capable of such thing. She's described him as being the second eldest of 8 children of the Iraqi Kurdish family, and he came to Ireland in 2006 under a UN protection programme. When he was 6, the family were given accommodation in Sligo, and he was living within the family home still at the time these crimes were committed. So apparently when Palani was 10 or 11, he was invited over to play with some local children, play football on the green, and he began kicking the children, not the football. And he was somebody that people were a little bit sort of wary of, and maybe they didn't include him so much. But nonetheless, there was no major standout thing, I think, within him. There was that little bit of that kind of thing.
Yeah, just
so
maybe
normal and ordinary, isn't it, as a family try to settle into a new culture and whatever.
And look, obviously the family came from tough circumstances. I mean, the Kurdish people suffered terribly, but I mean, obviously one of the points of public controversy of the case was the fact that the guards described them as being not radicalised in the court case. I mean, what I think they meant by that was that he wasn't part of any radical Islamic group that led him to commit these attacks.
No, he was a sort of a lone
person who seems to have and obviously his motivation is clear. His motivation is hatred of gay men. So that was a point of public controversy, but obviously,
but I mean, just it's so scary when there's no major warning signs there. Okay, so he's not very academic. He's intellectually challenged. He was described as in school a bit of a troublemaker. Maybe somebody you wouldn't be inviting to the football match to play if he's going to kick you.
Yeah.
But a little bit antisocial. But there's no kind of it's frightening to think that somebody can pick up a phone and put themselves on a dating app and go and commit such crimes one after the other.
Yeah, of course.
And your victims are literally at the touch of a button.
Of course, and in a place like Sligo, I mean, whatever about some American city, you might think these things could happen, but Sligo, obviously you just don't think that. And the people who are on the dating apps in a place like Sligo, a rural town at the end of the day, big town, but they obviously don't conceive that these things could happen. Palani,
You'd wonder what was his plan. Was he intending on continuing doing that until he got caught? Would he have taken a rest period? You described him as a serial killer, and usually they will take a rest period. He seems to be very, he's done this over a course of a few days. He's bound to get caught.
Yeah, I think that is the truth of it, that he was bound to get caught.
And maybe that's part of the sort of that intellectual challenge that he had, that he hadn't thought out.
Well, I think
to get away with it as such.
No, and they do think, don't they say, I mean, I don't claim to be an expert, but that there's the impulse control. There's a build up to this thing, and once it's done once, then the impulse control, the ability to control that impulse goes. And that obviously happened in this case, because just the fact that they were being committed, there's a digital trace for somebody who's contacting people through dating apps. Like, you are almost inevitably going to be found, especially if you're operating in a small, relatively small circle of people. So it is absolutely scary. He was
when you're killing somebody, of course. I mean, in many cases, people operating on dating apps, when they're assaulting either men or women, they can get away with it, of course, because there's an embarrassment, I think, in some cases, when somebody has maybe gone somewhere with an interaction and then they're embarrassed by how far they've gone themselves, and when it becomes assault or it turns bad, they sometimes don't report it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's that and
but murder is a completely different thing. Obviously, you have a crime scene, you have a full investigation, and it's not something that people are going to get away with.
No, but I mean, obviously, look, people like Yousef Palani, like they're not common in society at all. But it is. You see, like, you know, we talk about crimes all the time, a lot, mostly gangland, and you can see, if you look at it from the person's perspective, why they do what they do. You know, you might not think it's the right thing to do, but you can understand why somebody who might shoot somebody who, if there's been a build-up and they shot their friend or something like that, their motives aren't obscure or ununderstandable.
No, or else they're for money or whatever.
Yeah, whatever.
Totally.
Exactly. Or they might get sucked into something that they feel they can't get out of. So you can understand it. It doesn't mean that you can excuse it, but it's an explanation, not an excuse. With something like this that Palani has committed, in the absence of that, you know, gross disconnection from reality, which clearly wasn't there or would have been presented in court. Like, it's unsettling to think that has, you know, it's just what do you do with somebody like that?
What do you do for the rest of his life? 23 years of age in jail for life.
Yeah.
Barrier handled.
Yeah, and he won't be safe.
No.
Within that community, you know, because of the nature of his crimes.
Unlikely to make friends, to make...
You know, and how do you rehabilitate somebody like that? And if somebody can't be asked to come in from the yard, what are you meant to do? It's actually, the barrier handling is an interesting thing. I mean, you can see why civil liberties groups would say it's not ideal, because it must be, you know, you can understand that their argument that it's dehumanizing, but like, how are you meant to deal with people like that otherwise, you know?
Yeah.
So it is an interesting debate.
He's a bit of he stands out. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.